You know, I don't really think people appreciate just how different Far Cry was at the start. The original Far Cry came out in 2004, and at that time it was incredibly impressive. We really didn't see first-person shooters with that level of fidelity and environments that large, with level design relatively freeform like what we got in Far Cry. And despite Far Cry effectively being a tech demo for the CryEngine, it actually ended up being a pretty good first-person shooter. A very good first-person shooter at that. That's not to say it's perfect or anything, it's got plenty of problems, but it's a very solid first-person shooter and it's worth playing. Now, Crytek's output after Far Cry is another story entirely, but that's beside the point. It's also rather moot because the rest of the Far Cry series was developed by Ubisoft and not Crytek, and they went off in their own direction with it. Far Cry 2 tries some very interesting things. Most of them don't work, and it's really not a fun game in the slightest, but hey, at least it's different. And then Far Cry 3 came along, and it was actually really good. And it was made even better when they released the standalone expansion pack, Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, which is absolutely glorious. And after that is where the series really started to run into problems. Because you have to ask yourself, what is the identity of the Far Cry series? Because depending on which of the three prior mainline Far Cry games you look at, you could end up with a very different idea of what Far Cry is. The original Far Cry plays basically nothing like Far Cry 2 or Far Cry 3 or any of the subsequent games. And while Far Cry 2 was certainly an interesting idea, it's not fun at all, and it's not supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be overwhelmingly nihilistic and miserable, and that is exactly what Far Cry 2 is. So, it achieves what it sets out to be. The problem is that that really doesn't resonate with all that many people. Far Cry 3, on the other hand, went in a very different direction from Far Cry 2 while retaining a lot of the open world elements, and while it did draw inspiration from the likes of Heart of Darkness and all that sort of thing with its storyline, it didn't go so far into the nihilistic and miserable territory that you end up with the unfun mess of Far Cry 2. And while the game certainly has a fair few problems, and some of it really has not aged well in the decade since it was released, like, say, the dubstep, which was terrible back then and is even worse now. Generally speaking, you could say that Far Cry 3 is really the watershed moment for the Far Cry series. It's where the series' identity was fully solidified. And that was all well and good at the time, but here's the problem. It's developed by Ubisoft. And if there is one thing that Ubisoft absolutely excels at, it's running their franchises into the ground. Since the release of Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon, there have been 5 additional games in the Far Cry series. 3 mainline numbered entries, Far Cry 4, 5, and 6 respectively, 6 of course being the main subject of this video, and 2 spin-off titles, Primal and New Dawn. And each of these subsequent releases has dragged the series down further and further. We went from the heights of Far Cry 3 and Far Cry 3 Blood Dragon to mediocrity personified with Far Cry 4, the interesting idea on paper but really not very fun in execution of Far Cry Primal, the very messy Far Cry 5, and the downright awful Far Cry New Dawn. So then, of course, the question becomes, where do we stand as of Far Cry 6? Because that is the main subject of this video, and I've spent the first 4 minutes or so of the video talking about all the games that preceded it. Well, that's where things simultaneously get interesting and incredibly frustrating. Interesting in the sense that they definitely learned some lessons from Far Cry New Dawn. It is definitely not as bad as Far Cry New Dawn. Their villain this time around, Anton Castillo, played expertly by Giancarlo Esposito, is actually a threatening character who actually has reasons for doing what he's doing, and is actually a pretty compelling villain. And the absolutely terrible RPG-ish elements that they put into New Dawn with the rarity system for weapons and how it would turn enemies into damage sponges and such is far less of a thing, because they've done away with the rarity system entirely and have gone with a simple ranking system. Each zone has a level to it, and if you're not at least that level or higher, then you do less damage to the enemies there, but it's not a dramatically lessened damage effect. It's just enough to where you might need a couple of headshots to bring an enemy down as opposed to just one. So still annoying, but way better handled than what New Dawn did. The problem is that aside from making a few changes that are definitely a step up over New Dawn, all they've really managed to do is make it this awkward middle ground between Far Cry 5 and Far Cry New Dawn, and that's not a good thing, because I gave New Dawn a 1.5 out of 5, and I gave Far Cry 5 a 2 out of 5. Rather than actually try to innovate and really change things up for the Far Cry series, they've just decided to copy-paste the same formula they've had since Far Cry 3, which means that we're going on over a decade at this point, as I'm recording this video, but a decade or so as of the time Far Cry 6 came out, where they've basically just been recycling Far Cry 3, but not anywhere near as good. And don't get me wrong here, doing an iterative sequel where you just take what the previous game did and improve upon it is not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, look at Modern Warfare 2019 versus Modern Warfare 2 2022. 2022's Modern Warfare 2 is definitely an iterative sequel, but that wasn't a bad thing, because Modern Warfare 2019 was a really good base, and it had revitalized the Call of Duty franchise. The changes they made to the formula are still fresh enough to where doing a single iterative sequel, or even a second iterative sequel, is not necessarily a problem. Far Cry 6, on the other hand, is the culmination of a decade's worth of just rehashing the same thing over and over again, and continually homogenizing all of their games into one general blob of Ubisoft game. The vast majority of the game is just a bunch of side activities that are all basically the same. Go to a location, wipe out all the enemies. Congratulations, that accounts for most of the missions in the game, whether it be ambushes, or clearing out outposts, or clearing out checkpoints, or half the time doing anything else. Sometimes they even put the point that you have to go to wipe out those enemies really far away, and you have to make it there in under a few minutes. Ooh, variety. I'm really not joking when I say that that's the vast majority of content in Far Cry 6. The only other missions that even add the slightest bit of variety are timed races, whether that be with ground vehicles or flying through rings, neither of which is something that should remotely be in a Far Cry game, but apparently Ubisoft deemed it necessary. Beyond that, there's basically nothing other than collectible hunting and then the story missions, and the story missions are really just permutations of all the stuff I've already outlined up to this point. Only during the story missions you normally have to put up with even more insufferable characters than you have to put up with during the side content. Because at least for the side content, you're mostly dealing with generic NPCs that they just copy-paste all over the place, and so you can't take them seriously. Or if they are specific to that mission, you're probably only going to see them in that one mission and then never again. In the story, on the other hand, you're constantly running into these characters and you're constantly having to put up with their bullshit. I mean, seriously, Ubisoft expects you to root for the guys who have absolutely no plan beyond get rid of the Castillos and institute free elections. Neither of which is actually a plan, but rather is just a couple of goals, and they're certainly not going to lead to a free Yara. They're probably going to lead to exactly the same kind of thing that happens whenever you see a revolution like that, which is just trading one tyrannical dictator for another tyrannical dictator. But I get the feeling Ubisoft really didn't think very far ahead with that, and they probably don't want you to think about it much either. In fact, I'm pretty sure Ubisoft doesn't want you thinking about the writing in general, because they've written all of the characters to be basically self-centered, egotistical psychopaths. Most of whom sound like they spend way too much time with political circle jerks on Twitter, and more importantly, are apparently perfectly fine with murdering hundreds if not thousands of their own countrymen, often in downright gruesome and brutal ways, because, you know, the whole if you're not with us then you're our enemy and thus you must be exterminated thing. Also because apparently they think it's fun. And now you know why I say that all of the characters are psychopaths. This does have the unintended effect of making all of the virtue signaling that these characters are throwing around extremely ironic. It's even more ironic when you consider that it's Ubisoft who made this game and wrote those things in there. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, just look up all the things Ubisoft has been trying to sweep under the rug for the past few years. But I digress. The point is that these characters are just completely insufferable. They are ridiculously annoying, and they just scream corporate trying to pander to a certain demographic that wasn't in the slightest danger of giving a shit about the game anyway. Of course, they do give you the option of skipping all the cutscenes, and if you do that, then the game is noticeably more tolerable, but then you have to put up with the actual gameplay, and that is where I just couldn't force myself to finish this thing. I've already talked about how tedious and samey the missions are, but it goes further than that. It's the core gameplay loop, the stealth mechanics, and the actual combat. And I thought that this would be a bit different given that they introduced Supremos, which are basically a super weapon that has a charge-up timer, as well as ammo types that enemies respond differently to, so unarmored targets are much more easily dealt with soft point rounds, whereas heavily armored enemies are going to be weak against armor-piercing rounds, and so on and so forth, as well as the suppressors actually having limitations put on them so that they overheat, and once they overheat, they no longer suppress your weapon, and thus you go loud automatically. I thought that these changes would make at least some difference, and unfortunately, they really don't, because the core of the experience is completely ruined by how utterly brain-dead stupid the enemies are. It certainly doesn't help that there are only two difficulty settings, story mode and action mode. Action mode being effectively the normal difficulty setting and story mode being easy. Not that either of these really matter, because as far as I can tell, all story mode really does is make it so that you can take a hell of a lot more damage. In action mode, you can definitely take quite a bit of damage pretty quickly, but that doesn't really matter, because the enemies are so ridiculously stupid, and so ridiculously easy to exploit, and so ridiculously easy to take down, even if they are heavily armored and heavily armed, that there is absolutely no point they ever actually pose a threat to you. Even if they're in tanks, even if they're in helicopters, even if they're doing a strafing run with an aircraft, it does not matter. They pose absolutely no threat to the player whatsoever. Oh sure, your health will go down. You might even need to use the healing mechanic, of which you only get one charge. But that doesn't really matter, because the game gives you one of the best weapons right at the beginning and has you customize it so that it has a suppressor on it, as well as armor-piercing rounds, turning it into a effectively sniper rifle that can take out almost every single enemy in the game with a single headshot. I say almost every enemy because starting out you'll run into some enemies that are higher level than you are and you won't do as much damage to them, but once you've leveled up a few times, you don't need to worry about that anymore. Even then, it's still only going to take maybe 2 or 3 more headshots to bring them down, so it's not like you're really running into problems there. And as for tanks and aircraft and such, doesn't really matter if the enemy throws those at you because you have the Supremo, which will annihilate them in very short order, especially if you're using the rocket launcher variant, which homes in on enemy vehicles and just blasts them to pieces. This is a game that is so ludicrously easy that you have to go ridiculously far out of your way to make yourself weak in order to have even the slightest bit of challenge throughout the entire thing. And remember, this is a game that is around 20 hours long if all you do is go on the story missions. If you do any of the side content, it's closer to 30 plus hours. And nearly the entirety of what you're dealing with that entire time is roughly decade-old combat, because it's really not significantly different from what Far Cry 3 was doing, only with enemy AI that is somehow dumber than what we had in Far Cry 3, which is kind of impressive because the enemies weren't actually all that smart in Far Cry 3 either, but at least they were more competent than what you get in Far Cry 6. As well as decade-old, extremely simplistic stealth mechanics that are ridiculously easy to exploit, not to mention downright farcical considering that they make a big deal out of this semi-social stealth thing, where the idea is that you holster your weapons and then you can walk past the military folks without really ruffling any feathers, only that makes no sense given that your character is wandering around and basically cobbled together really weird looking armor and is wearing this big backpack of death on their back, and they're carrying at any time up to 4 very large, very powerful weapons that you could not possibly conceal. You mean to tell me that the military wouldn't notice something like that? You mean to tell me that these characters who basically go out of their way to call as much attention to themselves as they possibly can and do basically nothing to hide from the authorities are somehow flying under the radar at any given point in the game? You are asking the player to suspend their disbelief so much that they completely disconnect from anything that's going on in the game. And maybe, I guess, if you turn your brain completely off, you might be able to get something out of Far Cry 6. But I would highly recommend against doing that, because shutting your brain off that much would mean that you're basically a vegetable. The end result of all of this is that even though the art team definitely still does a good job, because they've done a good job with every Ubisoft game over the past decade or so, and they at least deserve praise for that, but that's just the art team. That's not the actual game designers. It's not the people who code the engine or anything like that. It's just the people who work on the art assets. They at least still do a good job, but everything else is just indicative of basically everything that is wrong with the gaming industry right now, and especially Ubisoft's crap. Mechanics that haven't seen any significant refinement in basically over a decade at this point, that are being presented with absolutely no finesse whatsoever. Enemy AI that is so brain-dead stupid it poses absolutely no threat to you, leading to a game difficulty that is so stupidly easy that I'm pretty sure only a concussed amoeba would have any difficulty playing through it at all. Shoveling in as much recycled content as possible, especially with the mission designs. Focusing entirely on keeping the player in the game as long as possible so that they potentially might buy into the microtransactions, of course, which happen to have multiple currencies, by the way, because we gotta have those extremely exploitative mobile game design principles shoved into the game, whether they belong there or not. All with an obvious disregard for the player actually enjoying any of that content, or just not having their time utterly wasted by it. Design choices that fly completely in the face of even the slightest application of logic, because the designers just clearly did not give a crap, and all wrapped up with writing that panders to certain demographics that frankly weren't even in the slightest danger of giving a crap about the game anyway, but it wins them corporate brownie points, so of course they're gonna shovel that in there at the expense of potentially alienating their fan base. But honestly, the absolute worst thing about it isn't any of the stuff that I've mentioned before. It's that at the end of the day, Far Cry 6 is not an outright bad game. Because if it were an outright bad game, it would be a lot more interesting than it actually is. It commits the absolute worst sin a video game can commit, which is that it's just boring. The current formula is completely played out. The engine is basically on its last legs at this point. If Ubisoft wants Far Cry to remain relevant and actually be interesting again, which I don't really think they do at this point, but let's just play devil's advocate here and assume they do, they need to do a ground-up refresh. In other words, basically the same kind of thing that happened with Modern Warfare 2019. Activision had been coasting along with the same engine for the better part of actually 2 decades, and then when Modern Warfare 2019 came out, it was a fresh start for the series. New engine, new mechanics, significant overhauls to existing mechanics, new design principles, a just new take on the series in general. It was fresh, it was interesting, and while it wasn't perfect, it breathed a lot of life into what had effectively become a hollow husk of a series. And that's exactly the kind of thing Far Cry needs right now. It needs that kind of dramatic overhaul, and I just have a feeling that Ubisoft is never going to give it the overhaul it deserves. So, until they prove me wrong on that, and they do a complete overhaul for the series, I'm done with this series going forward. I'll still take a look at the handful of Far Cry games I haven't covered already, which are basically the console games that were released between Far Cry and Far Cry 2. But unless the next Far Cry gets a massive overhaul to everything, I really don't see myself covering it. Thank you all very much for watching. If you like my videos, please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether it be getting more games for review, or replacing broken equipment, or getting a new equipment, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's perfectly fine. I understand. The option's there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you all in later videos.